Carl, you mentioned the Trump's NSS, National Security Strategy, in which you mentioned that they're somehow putting the burden of the war in Ukraine on the shoulders of Europeans. What is going on? Looking at the situation with NATO, you remember when Sweden and Finland joined NATO, Joe Biden was bragging about, NATO is getting stronger, you know, they're getting more united. Today, looking at NATO, what is the reality of NATO for Europeans? Because after all, you're looking at the Middle East, the way that Europeans have somehow they didn't cooperate with Iran with the JCPOA. They did what the United States wanted them to do. Looking at the case of Russia in Ukraine, they're doing the same. The war has just devastated the economy of Germany. Most of Europe has been influenced by the war, and they're trying to make a new front with China as well. We've seen the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom's Keir Starmer talking about China is the greatest threat to Europe, to the United Kingdom. What is the meaning of NATO today, and what would be the better future for Europe if they want to change the game, if they want to be a better player in the big picture?
Well, I think, first of all, there's a lot of misunderstandings regarding NATO. First of all, from the European perspective, and you can see that perfectly with the example of Finland and Sweden, for instance, and probably some other countries such as Ukraine, they consider NATO as a national security asset, if you want. NATO is a collective security system, not for individual countries. It is a tool that has been developed in case of an all-out war between the East and the West. The Warsaw Pact, the Warsaw Pact didn't exist in 1949, but the communist bloc against the Western democracies. That is the ideological framework under which NATO was constructed. Now, NATO, again, and it's very important to remind people, NATO is a nuclear alliance. The ultimate goal of NATO is not to protect individual countries from the attack of Russia or whatever. It is to put all the European countries under the US nuclear umbrella. And that's the reason why it's very difficult to activate NATO in a situation such as the Ukrainian one. By the way, you noticed already that in the last 2 or 3 years, last two years, in order to ensure the security or some agreement with Ukraine, it was not NATO that had a security agreement with Ukraine. You had the NATO countries having bilateral security agreements with Ukraine, but not NATO. Because NATO is not tailored for this kind of conflict. NATO is tailored for the all-out war on the European continent. That's why NATO was built. NATO was created when Soviet Union got the nuclear bomb. That's what prompted the creation of NATO, because European countries at that time were scared by the fact that Soviet Union had now access to the nuclear power. And that's the rationale for creating NATO. The Warsaw Pact was created 6 years later as Germany entered NATO. That's what prompted the creation of the Warsaw Pact in 1955. So, meaning that the NATO is built around nuclear power. And for that reason, when Finland or Sweden entered NATO in order to improve their own national security, they made a totally wrong choice. It is based on their ignorance of the reality of NATO. That's the very first aspect. The second aspect is that NATO, as it was said, it's not that the US should protect for all cases Europe. It just provide the nuclear power. In order to have this, to be sure that the US would be involved in a conflict and therefore would be ready to commit nuclear power or their nuclear arsenal, that's the reason why you still have US troops in Germany, to force the US to be committed in case of an all-out war in Europe. Otherwise, even if you had a war in Europe and the Americans would be left in the continent, they could say, well, okay, that's a European matter. We don't want to be involved. And for that reason, in order to force the US to be committed, that's the reason why the Europeans asked the US to stay in Europe. So the US forces in Germany, which started to be deployed as occupation force, as you had British and French forces after 1945 in Germany, the US changed the status of this force. I mean, after the end of the Cold War, as the occupation forces, the French and the British, withdrew from Germany, the US stayed because they need to have this physical commitment in the case of a nuclear war, because that requires that the US have something at stake in the conflict, and namely their forces in Germany. So that's the rationale. Now, the failing understanding that has, of course, led Sweden and Finland to enter NATO, which is a bad calculus, because now they are part of the threat from the Russian side, as viewed from the Russians. As a result, Russians have started to deploy forces on the other side of the border of Finland, and because now Finland becomes part of the picture of the threat. So that's where we are. But the idea originally was not to have the US to substitute themselves to the national defense of the Europeans. And that's the reason why already in his first mandate, Trump asked the European countries to spend more on defense, because already during the first mandate he said that European defense must be in the hand of Europeans. And for the Europeans, of course, it was convenient to have the Americans, because that would trigger the nuclear threat and a kind of a dissuasion and things like this, and therefore they had not to spend too much on defense. Therefore, the US was spending on defense. You will say the US always overspent in defense. They wage wars all over the world, and therefore, I mean, I'm not sure that the European defense was the bulk of the US defense spending. In any case, today the Americans want to reduce their expenses. They want to develop the industry in continental US and things like this. I mean, on the Western Hemisphere, to take the terminology of the national security strategy, and therefore they want to reduce their spending in Europe, saying, well, Europeans have to develop their own defense capabilities, and the US will come as a backstopping to that. That's more or less the idea. And that's exactly what Pete Hegseth said in February to the allies. So there is no surprise there. And NATO will remain NATO. This idea of putting all the nations under the nuclear umbrella, that has not changed. What has changed is the substance of the war. Because obviously, even during the Cold War, we overestimated the willingness of the Soviet Union to attack the West. And of course, everybody played by this kind of rule. So we accepted this exaggeration of the threat. Fine. But today we are in a more complex economic situation. I mean, the Cold War was in the golden age of the European civilization, if you want. We had a growth all over the West. We are exporting. We had political influence. We played and things like that. And I mean, this was starting to decay during the 70s, but nevertheless, during the Cold War, by and large, it was the golden age of the European economy, society, civilization, if you want, if you can put it that way, to simplify. But today, after the Cold War, it was clear that we had other priorities, and therefore we would not have this all-out war for which NATO was tailored. And today we can see the conflict in Ukraine is an example for that.
I think there would never be such a fight, Colonel.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. No, absolutely right. This has never been the case. This is an illusion we had during the Cold War, but we can afford it. We could afford it. That's the problem. Is now we can have the same illusion, but we cannot afford it anymore. Therefore, we need to be more realistic. But you're absolutely right. This kind of conflict will not happen. Therefore, that's the reason why I'm not an advocate of NATO. I mean, I don't have problem with countries getting together in order to organize a common defense. And I think that's rational. That's not a bad idea. The problem is that we have to prepare for the right conflict, first of all. And NATO is obviously was not tailored for the kind of conflict we may face in Europe, Ukraine being a case in point. It's too strong, if you want. Or the idea of NATO is too strong for the kind of conflict we have in Ukraine, because obviously we don't want to go nuclear in that conflict. So we see that the NATO is oversized for this kind of conflict. Conceptually, I'm not saying factually, but conceptually it's oversized. So we need to have another kind of architecture in Europe. We need to redesign the whole idea of defense. What do we understand under defense? And that's exactly what the Russians wanted just after the end of the Cold War, in fact, by entering NATO, with this idea that I've mentioned several times on your channel, this idea of security by cooperation instead of security by confrontation. And in fact, that's the real problem here, that the Europeans continue to stick to this idea of NATO because they don't want to spend too much money, because obviously you have a lot of other, if you look at the budget of all these countries, Germany, France, UK, you can see that all are in a deficit because, of course, we have no more challenges regarding the social challenges, societal challenges, and things like that, that cost a lot of money. And therefore, defense has been left to the hundreds of priority, but not in the first priority anymore. And therefore, this idea of the Americans saying, now you have to take over, you have to realize what defense means. And for that reason, there is something people have forgotten, but that was done by the Trump administration in February, was to share with European NATO countries a questionnaire asking them how they figure out what defense would be if the US were not there.